Hello and welcome. This is the Billings Gazette, and I am here off camera, Daryl Ehrlich with sports editor, 406MT sports editor, Jeff Welsch. And today we're talking about his upcoming series that's online,
238 Montana communities.
238 Montana communities, the greatest high school athletes to come out of each one of those communities. You may have a hard time getting to 238 communities on a Montana map, correct?
That's pretty close. If you look at the official state of Montana population map, it lists roughly half that number of communities. And then there's a lot of other little dots on the map. And so we're representing almost more than twice the quote unquote population centers of Montana.
Right. We use that term loosely.
Very loosely.
So let's talk about this is about a year-long project?
Exactly.
What gave rise to this?
Well, Daryl, in my many roles with 406MT Sports, I'm in Helena all the time, and I go the same route. So one day, I just looked out my window and saw this sign that said Raidersburg 9, and I'd never been to Raidersburg. And so I took the scenic route to Helena, went into this old historic mining town, and interestingly did not see a single soul from one end of the street to the other, which was maybe about 2 football fields long. But as I stopped and looked around and took some pictures and poked around, I learned some fascinating information there. One being that Myrna Loy, the actress, grew up there, and President Ulysses S. Grant stopped by there once and stayed in a hotel overnight. And there was this fellow named Cecil Elba Larry Duff, who played Major League Baseball, was born there in the late 1800s. And you know what I started to realize was that there's probably a story like this in almost every Montana community. And that really was the genesis of this project that's been a labor of love, which is to find out who are the nuggets in every Montana community, to the extent that I can find them.
Right. So what about stopping and learning about that? How did it go from Raidersburg to an entire state?
Well, initially I thought, well, there has to be more of these nuggets. And so I just started looking at some of the other people, the famous people who are from Montana. I looked at Sports Illustrated's list of the top 50 athletes of up until the year 2000 when this came out. And but I think more than anything was just wondering, okay, here's Raidersburg. What about St. Regis? What about Outlook? I started to think about places like that where I knew, for instance, Robin Selvig, the legendary Montana women's basketball coach, was from Outlook. But what about Peerless just down the road? And one thing led to another. I would turn over a rock, another rock would overturn. The next thing I knew, I was neck deep in this project and couldn't start. It was stop. It was almost intoxicating.
Did you originally start thinking that it was going to be just a confined area, or did you think big? Did you think the entire Big Sky State?
Well, originally I thought, okay, how about let's do every community that has a high school, because each one of those would have a greatest athlete, and probably in most communities, that's who their greatest athlete would be. But as I kept digging deeper into this, I would run into athletes such as Jeff Lockwood, the great champion bull rider who went to Broadus High School, but is actually from Volberg. And the more I looked into this, the more I discovered stories like that. A very well-known name up on the High Line is Tilleman, especially in Havre. Mike Tilleman, who played in the NFL for many, many years, was a great athlete at Chinook. And so for several months, he was my Chinook representative until I found out, looking back through newspapers going back 100 years, that the family ranch was actually just outside of Zurich. And so I thought, well, there has to be more situations like that, and turns out there were many.
Okay. What was your most surprising discovery?
Well, I was really stunned many months into this to hear about the first legally deaf player in the National Basketball Association, a great college star at Weber State and then at the University of Utah, Lance Allred. Turns out the first half of his youth in his birth community was Pinesdale, which is in the Bitterroot Valley, is a fundamentalist Mormon community. And he lived there until he was 7 or 8 before the family left the commune, if you will, and actually moved to Salt Lake. And so there were a number of instances, stories like that. But it just struck me that here I was 6 or 7 months into this project, and I'm just finding this out.
Yeah. What are there any communities in which you thought, I know that's easy, and it turns out it's not so easy?
Yeah. I have to think about that one for a moment. There were a lot that seemed pretty obvious, and I would put this person in there, and then of course I would do some digging and would come up with somebody else. Can't think of a specific example off the top of my head, but Miles City, for instance, I imagine there would be a number of great rodeo cowboys or cowgirls. And then also some high school athletes. And it turned out, there was a fellow named Russ Sweet who, this was almost a century ago. He was a great, great athlete in a number of sports, went to the University of Montana, excelled there, and then even went beyond that in athletics. And those were some of the nuggets that through time that I was able to uncover.
Are you afraid that you've missed someone?
Oh, yeah. I have a column here that I wrote about this experience and how, this past summer I was in Terry on my way back from a vacation, and I'm sitting in front of the little gas station, grocery convenience store there, talking with a woman named Leanne Lantis, who has lived there for 46 years, coached, played, knows the town inside and out, and we're discussing this project. And I'm asking her, who does she think is the greatest of all time there? She comes up with a name. I have another name, a football player in the MHS record books. And as we're doing this, this woman gets out of a pickup truck and starts walking toward us. And Leanne says, well, there's the greatest athlete of all time right there. Turns out it was Lacey Haugian, who was a great basketball player and track athlete in Terry, and was an All-American college basketball player and went on to play pro ball in Europe, the only professional athlete ever to come from Terry. And so I'm realizing at the moment this is so fortuitous, and at the same time, do I have to go to every town in Montana and sit in front of the convenience store and hope the greatest athlete steps out for this to be 100% accurate?
Right. Has this journey taken you across Montana?
It has. Between my professional work and my personal life and the explorations I do, it has to almost every place except maybe the far northeastern corner. Although, interestingly enough, that's where some of the more fascinating stories came from, because I learned that in the 1960s and 70s, Class C basketball up there was dominant. And then now all of these schools, or most of these schools, have closed. Peerless, Outlook, Hoagland, the list actually goes on. And yet these were just powerhouses. I think one decade won 8 of the 10 state championships. And so then the challenge was to find out, okay, who are the great basketball players from these communities? And as you can imagine, being that remote, it wasn't easy to find names in the statistics.
Yeah. Did you, how far back did you have to go for some of these?
I have athletes who were either born or even competed in the late 1800s. There are some extraordinary names from the 20s and the 30s and the 40s. One fascinating story that I got out of a book written by Sally Jenkins of the Washington Post called Everybody's All-Americans. It turns out there was a football player at the Carlisle Indian School where they had to be very creative because they were smaller athletes. And this fellow in particular was a very fast lineman who they went to a local tailor, sewed a pocket or pouch on his jersey, and used that to hide the ball, the football, in a game against Harvard. And this fellow ran about 100 yards for a touchdown on a kickoff. Ended up changing the rules of college football after that because Amos Alonzo Stagg wasn't happy about this. But this fellow turned out to be a Sioux Indian from Wyola, Montana, of all places, and lived his life as a blacksmith there. Just all kinds of fascinating stories like that.
Yeah. Do you, what's the most either odd or incredible athlete that you came across? Because obviously you've got the traditional basketball, but athletics takes a lot of different forms, right?
Exactly. You know, there's, of course, this being Montana, there's a fair number of rodeo athletes. I also have mushers. I mean, we have the first non-Alaskan Iditarod winner, who's from Lincoln, Montana, Doug Swingley, 4-time winner. His name is still 2 4-letter words in Alaska. You know, and I thought one of the odder ones was an Olympic rower, being from Broadview, of all places, about as landlocked a community as we have in Montana. And she actually attended high school at Billings Central. Again, what makes this so challenging is that that's who she's associated with, Billings and Billings Central. And she went on from Broadview, though, to Monica Trinnell to be an Olympic rower and is now an attorney in Missoula.
What about now? Obviously, when you get in this is the kind of these are the kind of stories that usually produce arguments that go on sometimes for decades in convenience stores or even town bars. Do you think that is this the definitive list, or are you gonna? You seem to be starting a lot of arguments with something like this.
Well, you know, in fact, I don't see it as a definitive list yet. Mm-hmm. I think that we can make a compelling argument for every single person on this list. At the same time, in some regards, I see it as a starting point. You know, for instance, do I have someone from Malta who actually lived in a small town, grew up in a ranch outside a small town outside of Malta? I think I've got a lot of those covered, but I don't doubt that as soon as this comes out and people see the list, they're going to say, well, what about so-and-so? And what about, well, this person is from here, because I actually think there are still about 75 or so dots on the Montana map that are unrepresented at this point.
Yeah. So what's your plan? What's your hope? Let's ask that question.
Well, my hope is that this will generate a great deal of conversation across the state, and I have some confidence that it will. I have an anecdotal experience when I was in Jordan this summer working on a feature story on their high school football team, and I was there about an hour and a half early and went to the rancher to meet up with some people I knew there. And for that next hour and a half, that's all anybody could talk about, and it was, who'd you pick from here? Who'd you pick from Ekalaka? Who'd you pick from Plentywood? And so I think this will generate some conversation, and then I hope the next step is for people to weigh in and say, well, here's a good choice from this little place, and so that by the time we get a really comprehensive list going, that we could turn this into perhaps a coffee table book that could sit on a table in Montanans' home from Absarokee to Zurich.
Yeah. Now, are you listing other notables who, I mean, because it's really hard to compare, say, a rodeo athlete with a basketball player.
Well, it is, and that's where making the choices involved a lot of aspects here. It wasn't just, I mean, typically a 3-sport athlete is going to be your greatest athlete, even though you've got a musher who's won the Iditarod, or a rower, or an Olympian in a specific event. So I have toyed with the idea of an honorable mention list, and started one, and it went on and on and on. But point taken. I mean, if you look at Billings, for instance, look how many great athletes have come from Billings that aren't going to be on this list. Great Falls is the same, Missoula, some of our larger communities. I did get fortunate in a few cases where names that were associated with a larger city, such as Billings, I won't give away who our Billings choice is, but Dan Mortensen, one of the great rodeo athletes of all time, is generally associated with Billings Actually, the family ranch is is Lockwood, and so I caught a break there. The same thing was true, say, with Great Falls. Probably the greatest Olympic rifle marksman of all time is Lonis Wigger. He's generally associated with Great Falls, but actually grew up in Carter. I did catch some breaks there, but yes, there will be some phenomenal names that are left off the list.
And it's kind of cool too because, for example, like Raidersburg, you've got places that really don't exist anymore, but produced amazing athletes, right?
Yeah, or they may exist just as a dot on the map. Raidersburg being that, I think there are now 75 full-time residents there, where at one time it was 2,000 at the second largest mining city in Montana. But I do have places like Pony, which is a suburb of Harrison, and Sula at the upper end of the Bitterroot Valley. And then you look at places such as Wisdom and Divide, Wise River, that may have a saloon and a grocery store, and that's it. And yet some great athletes grew up either in those communities or outside them.
No way to necessarily do an apples to apples comparison, but as you've done this project, does Montana have a larger number of great athletes? Is there something that makes this state unique? It seems like you were able to find great athletes virtually any dot on the map.
Well, I have found myself wondering how this compares to, say, Idaho or Wyoming or the Dakotas, which do have their fair share of great athletes themselves. But I am struck by the number of athletes who wound up on the national and international stage who come from Montana.
Why do you think that is?
Well, maybe there's nothing else to do after you're done, with the cattle and the wheat fields or the lentil fields. But I know there's a great sense of pride in this state. The old saying about Montana is just one community with very long streets. And I think the one thing among very few perhaps that connects people is athletics. And so even though we don't have professional teams or the major college teams, this is still a great source of pride in this state.
Mm-hmm. Do you, if you would have known coming into this little drive, this diversion in Helena to Raidersburg, if you would have known that it would have led to this, would you do it all again?
Well, a part of me says I'd be crazy to do it, but I tell you what, this has been so enlightening, the most enlightening project I've done, and I've learned so much about Montana and the people who are from here or who have done this place proud. And in hindsight now, I am so glad that I did it. I think we're going to get a lot of stories out of it. I think we're going to get a lot of interaction with our readers because of it, or at least I hope so. And so I think that makes it all worthwhile. At the same time, it almost feels like it's a project that could be never ending. And that's where I'm hoping our readers will chime in and maybe put an exclamation mark on some of this for us.
Yeah, what's the most obscure place that you had to look for information?
The obscure communities were places like Powderville out in southeastern Montana, where there was a great Montana State football player who went to Plevna High and actually was from Powderville. But, probably there were so many sources, whether it was individuals who've lived here for a long, long time and have been in various corners of the state. A lot of our media people I checked in with, books, but I would say probably the most valuable resources were the newspapers going back 100 years. The Gazette, the Great Falls paper, the Butte paper, Helena. I would just in some cases luck into a snippet and see a name and say, I've got to explore this further, and then do a search for that name. And in some cases museums and directors of museums, and then in other cases it was just people who'd lived in communities a long time. But newspapers were, I think, far and away the most valuable source.
Is it hard comparing athletes of one generation to another, even if you're in the same sport?
I thought it was. I use the example of Miles City's Russ Sweet, who was just a great, great athlete for his time. How would he do if he were at Miles City today? I'm sure he would still be a great athlete. He was very fast, and yet, so I had to judge that a little bit. I mean, it's just like baseball going back to the 20s and Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig. I think we'd all agree that the athletes today are probably better. So some of this was relative to the time that they were in.
Mm-hmm. Were there any that you had to rule out because they weren't purely of one community, or maybe not Montana based, or how strictly did you draw those lines?
Well, that's a great question, because some of it was just almost gut instinct or just a feel. For instance, Phil Jackson, the great, the Lakers Hall of Fame coach, was born in Deer Lodge and has some connection to Montana, but I didn't feel like he necessarily fit. So I have somebody else from Deer Lodge. At the same time, Jerry Kramer, the NFL Hall of Famer, the first 6 years of his life were in Montana, most of them in Jordan. And yet, if you compare the impact on Phil Jackson to Deer Lodge versus Jerry Kramer in Jordan, where his family is very entrenched, they've got a street named after him. He named his son after the town. And his uncle from Cohagen, a great rodeo, and his aunt actually, who's on our list from Cohagen, Bobby Brooks Kramer. So you look at the impact. There's not just a flat, hard and fast rule for any of this. You might argue, I'll give away my Shoto guy, but it's Flint Rasmussen, the great rodeo clown, who was a very good athlete at Shoto High in his time. You could argue, well, maybe he's not an athlete, but in terms of what he's done on the national and world stage, it's hard to argue. So again, it comes back to some of this was just what it felt like.
Yeah. So you're not Ismay doesn't get to claim Joe Montana.
Well, funny that you mentioned that. I have one a little bit offbeat pick, and I have Joe Montana as my Ismay. And people can look and read and see why that is. I do, in fairness to Ismay, also mention 2 rodeo cowboys who are from there, who had some pretty good resumes on the circuit. Right. Not to the Jess Lockwood level, but certainly they're both Hall of Famers. But had to have a little fun with that one.
Sure. What about, is there one sport that Montanans seem to excel at more than either what you would expect, or you can say this is really our state sport after looking around the entire, more than the populous areas?
Yeah, no, I don't know that there were any surprises there. Rodeo was big, and actually rodeo enabled me to come up with somebody from a lot of these small communities, because so many rodeo cowboys and cowgirls grew up on ranches. And basketball and football definitely jumped out, and I think I was struck by the number of terrific basketball players who have come from Montana, and the number that I had to leave off. Fair number of mushers are from here, some Olympians, a few skiers, as you might imagine, but I don't know that there were any surprises there.
Okay.
Baseball, maybe. I'll tell you this, baseball. Basically we have American Legion now. We have one college program. People wouldn't think much of baseball as a sport in Montana because of our weather. But if you go back 100 years, baseball was huge in this state. And there were some baseball people who made it pretty big from back in the day. And I'd really be curious to see what happened to baseball and why, when every community basically had its own baseball team, that baseball has more or less vanished from the landscape.
Yeah. What about a sport that I recall when I've gone back, because I've gone back in a lot of old newspapers, that seem to have gotten a lot of play, maybe more professionally? What about boxing?
Boxing has a really unique history in Montana.
Yeah. From the Con Warham days on.
And there's you look at a Marvin Campbell, for instance, and he's pretty well known. Todd Foster, who's from Great Falls, so even though he's probably one of the top 50 great athletes, and he doesn't make the list because we've got somebody else from Great Falls. But then there were there were a few others. People might remember the obituary we ran a couple of years ago on Francis K. Turley, who was the boxer that Muhammad Ali said in his biography hit him the hardest of anybody that he'd ever fought against, a Montana cowboy. And again, this is where this was so enlightening. Generally speaking, Turley was thought to be from Roundup. Turns out that he grew up off the grid just outside of Muscle Shell. So I get to have somebody else from Roundup. There's a boxer from Opportunity who was actually featured in Sports Illustrated in a lengthy story a half century ago, and another from Bonner. So yes, boxing has definitely had a history here.
That's just fascinating. Well, so anything on your next project, or is the next project taking a well-earned breather?
I have a feeling this is going to be the next project as we move along here and we discover what else is out there. But the beauty of something like this in our digital age is it can live forever, and we can
be updated.
We can reboot it and update it. And so I'm really hoping that our readers feel like that this is partly their project too, and can have a piece in it.
So are you encouraging people to reach out if they think they can top your list, or they may help fill in one of those dots on the map?
I'm encouraging readers to reach out for any reason, but yes, filling in some of those dots on the map would be huge. Or if I can move somebody from one community to another to make room for a great choice there. So yes, I would love to hear from our readers on this.
Last question. Is there any high school athlete today or very, very recently that topped the list? You don't have to give it away, but we tend to think of every generation thinks they were the greatest.
Yeah.
Are there any current athletes that are giving the historical ones a run for their money?
I can tell you that there are 3 at the moment who are either current. So our youngest one happens to be from Fraser.
Okay.
And was featured in the Washington Post a year ago. Okay. After they saw our feature. Also, Melstone, somebody who just graduated from there in the spring, and there are a couple others up on the High Line who are very, very recent graduates, and then there are a few who are currently playing college sports in Montana.
So this isn't just a look back into the 1890s.
No, I would say most of our athletes actually were probably in the last 20 to 30 years, but it's definitely a century-long list.
Great. Jeff, thanks so much for talking with us. Thanks so much for doing the project. This is Daryl Ehrlich with Jeff Welsch. Thanks for listening.